We're very proud to be able to speak to Alex Safian of Camera. As my readers know, Camera is a hugely influential organization as far as finding and fighting against media bias against Israel. Thank you very much. Can you just explain in your own words, what Camera is all about and how it started?
Camera is a media watch group that focuses on coverage of Israel and surrounding areas in the American media, in the Spanish media, in the British media, now working also in the Hebrew-speaking media, all in an attempt to get fair and accurate coverage that lives up to the usual standards of journalism, things like fairness, accuracy, honesty, context, getting the full story out rather than getting a deceptive story out that only looks at part of the facts or part of the story. We want the full story to come out. That's what we try to do every single time, is get the journalists to do good journalism. Mm-hmm. We have Perspectiva, which concentrates on the Israeli media because many of the worst stories about Israel actually originate in the Israeli media. And then just gets used by the international media, which says, well, we're not anti-Israel, we're just quoting from the New York Times of Israel, Haaretz, which bills itself as the New York Times of Israel. We're just saying what they say, so how can you criticize us? So we decided we need to deal with the source of much of the anti-Israel propaganda and memes, and that's right here in Israel. They often accuse Israelis of being racist for not seeing the Palestinians, but in fact they're the ones who don't see the Palestinians. They will claim that there are Jewish-only roads that Palestinians actually drive on. They're the ones that are not seeing the Palestinians on what they falsely call Jewish-only roads, which then goes viral around the world, saying, the Jews have Jewish-only roads, which is completely false.
One of the many accusations that people hurl against Israel is that they have, apartheid land policies, that they are, they're Jewish, places that only Jews can buy or live. And that actually, that certainly makes inroads. It certainly makes an impression on the world. What have you been doing to, what's the truth, and what have you been doing to fight it?
This is actually the issue that brought me to Camera in the first place, was researching this issue, which was a little bit difficult. But if you look at Noam Chomsky's books, you will find, especially The Fateful Triangle, which is sort of a wonderful handbook for the anti-Israel activist, you will find this charge. He didn't originate it, but he propagated it, that 93% of the land in Israel is owned by the state, and you have to show 4 generations of Jewish blood in order to have any access to it. In other words, you have to be Jewish according to the law of return, essentially, to have any access to this land. So essentially claiming that the 20% of the country that's not Jewish is restricted to 7% of the land. And this is widely believed among anti-Israel activists. It's widely believed at The Guardian. They actually publish this sort of thing. And it's completely false. It's absolutely, utterly false. Land is a complicated story in Israel because some of the land policies predate the state. There was a competition for land among Jews and Arabs. So, for instance, there was land owned by the Waqf, which was for Muslims only. There was land owned by the JNF, which was created sort of in reaction to the Waqf and this restriction against Jews owning land on the part of Arabs to try to get some Jewish land. But when the JNF eventually was folded into the state, in the relatively early days of the state, that policy of JNF land being for Jews only essentially ended. And so the fact of the matter is that pretty much all land in Israel, all public land in Israel, is available pretty much to any Israeli citizen. When Israeli Arabs have wanted to rent land, because much of the land in Israel at this point is rented, though that's changing, when Israeli Arabs have wanted to rent land that was JNF, therefore technically not available to them, what has usually happened is the land is traded between the JNF and the government, so it becomes government-owned land, state-owned land. The JNF gets other land, and the Israeli Arab can rent the land. So it's sort of one of these typical accommodations that Israel makes, kind of like, the censorship issue, where, there's censorship, except the Israeli journalists then give the story to a foreign journalist. It gets reported in a foreign magazine or newspaper, and then you can report it in Israel. So there's always these ways around what seem to be restrictive laws in which you get around them without actually changing the law. So that's exactly what happened with land. The vast majority of land in Israel that is publicly held one way or another is available to every Israeli citizen. So that's the kind of thing where there's rank propaganda against Israel, where if you actually look at the facts, you can find lots of Israeli Arabs, including famous well-known politicians, like Azmi Bashara, living on state land that he rents from the state, just like his Jewish neighbors in Upper Nazareth, for instance. And yet he will then make the claim that Arabs don't have access to land in Israel, when he himself is living on Israel, so-called Israel lands that he rents from the state, just like just like many other Israelis have these 49-year long-term leases. So it's an utter lie. He knows it because his signature's on the papers.
Do you get the impression, because I certainly seem to get this impression, that sometimes a token story, a token pro-Israel story will be published just, for a pseudo-balance, and then they can go back?
I think that happens. I think that definitely happens. And I think there's make-up stories, not just a token story, but they'll do a story that is fair to Israel, and then they'll get hammered. They'll get hammered not just from pro-Palestinian people in America, they'll get threatened here. And so there are real threats, We often joke that if you do an anti-Israel story, you'll get an award for courage from Jewish groups in America. But if you do a pro-Israel story, you'll get real threats over here, serious threats. For instance, when 9/11 happened and there were Palestinians celebrating in the streets, there was a lot of pressure on journalists here not to show that. And a Reuters journalist in particular had video. And the PLO, the PA, threatened him and said specifically that we cannot guarantee the safety of your journalists anywhere in the Arab world if you show this video. And Reuters publicly stated that we're not going to show the video because we have to think of the safety of our journalists first. They admitted it. This was not just something done privately. They admitted it, that they were not going to show this video that they had because they were being threatened.